So Sustainable Saratoga is a not-for-profit organization that works to encourage sustainable practices and the protection of natural resources in the Saratoga area. We are a volunteer-driven organization focusing on providing educational resources and opportunities for people to take meaningful actions, both as individuals as well as a society, to reduce our impact on the planet. Some of you might be familiar with some of our popular events like Saratoga Recycles Day or Treetoga tree planting effort that's coming up here in a couple weeks. Others might be familiar with some of our advocacy work to protect our lakes and rivers, to demand action to address the climate crisis and to protect our valuable open spaces. So hopefully, if you don't already, you can follow us on social media to keep up to date on what we're working on and our upcoming events and future pollinator focused talks. One of our initiatives this year is focused on creating pollinator habitat and food sources. We depend on pollinators for so much of the food that we eat, and pollinators need our help. They're being threatened by chemical use, disease, habitat loss, and climate change. And we can all do something to help. So it doesn't matter if you have a tiny little container or 2 acres of yard, you can plant something that will benefit pollinators. If anybody's interested in joining our volunteer effort on that, be sure to reach out to me, Wendy at sustainablesaratoga.org. And so with that, thank you for signing on. I'm going to turn it over to Rachelle. In addition to being a board member of Sustainable Saratoga, Rachelle Thomas owns Daisies and Dahlias, a garden design and plant care company in Saratoga Springs. Chances are, if you've been downtown anytime in the last few years, you've seen some of Rachelle's handiwork around town. Even just following her business's social media account can brighten your day, I guarantee it. So thank you very much for agreeing to do this tonight, and I turn it over to you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you everybody for joining, especially on such a dreary day. I think this is just like, with snow in the forecast, this is just perfect to be talking about vegetable gardening. So I'm Rachelle. As she mentioned, my business is Daisies and Dahlias, and a lot of our work involves flowers for businesses and homeowners. But when it comes to my home garden, I actually just grow vegetables because they're yummy. And it's just really rewarding to me to have a vegetable garden at home. I find that it's very grounding. And I'm just hoping that I can help you guys if any of you are feeling intimidated by vegetable gardening or not sure how to start or just looking for some inspiration. That's my goal for tonight. So I'm just gonna run through the presentation, but if any of you guys have any questions at any point, please speak up or just write it in the chat, and I'll get to it at the end. So without further ado, this is Grow Foods, Not Gardens. So I do want to preface that I am really lucky to live in a place where I have the space and the sunshine and a landlord who doesn't care about how the yard looks. And I know not everybody has that, especially with certain neighborhoods with HOAs. There are standards that people have when it comes to their yards, but you can still grow food in containers. But this is the garden that I grew last year during COVID, when things were all up in the air and everything was unsure. So I just grew a big garden because I knew I could do that and I could share food with other people around. So when you're considering growing a garden, there are some things to think about, such as what you like to eat. You don't want to grow something you're not going to enjoy. How much space do you have? Some plants get really big, some keep to themselves. Cold crops versus warm crops, because certain crops that you plant early spring, by the time summer comes, they're all done. So that frees up some more space in your garden for other veggies. And then container gardening versus growing in the ground. And again, that has to do with space or the quality of soil that you're working with. And there's pros and cons to both. And as you can see, this is how my garden started, early season, and that's how it ended up late summer. So it's good to kind of think about what you're going to plant before you plant it and how it's going to end up throughout the season. So some things to think about if you've never grown any vegetables, plants that spread out, or like the squash families, pumpkins, watermelons. You don't want to plant those unless you have at least like a 10-foot diameter for them to really spread out. If space is an issue, then plants like peppers, eggplants, beans, greens, beets, those kind of keep to themselves and stay within like a couple foot radius. So those are good. And then you're going to want a trellis or a cage for things like tomatoes and peas and cucumbers. And when you're thinking about how much vegetables you're going to get from your garden, the ones that continually produce, like you harvest them, and that actually encourages more growth from them, like beans, peppers, eggplant, kale. There's more vegetables out there. This is just like a brief list to get started, just some things to think about if you don't have any experience. So to grow a garden, you're going to need plants. And so you can start your own seedlings, you can buy seedlings, and you can plant seeds right in the ground. And I'll go over which ones to do when. But when you're starting your seedlings, when in doubt, just read the seed packets. They all have the information on how deep to plant them and how long the germination cycle is. But generally, you want to start seeds about 6 to 8 weeks before planting outside at the end of May, because you want them to be a few inches tall. The idea is that here in upstate New York, a lot of vegetables you can't plant until there's no more frost risk at the end of May. And so by planting them inside a few weeks ahead of time, you can extend that growing season. And I know a lot of people, especially here in New York, in the dead of winter, we get so sick of the snow. And so everybody is excited to start their seedlings in like January or February. And unfortunately, that's a little bit too early for a lot of seedlings. So again, just refer to packets. You can buy seeds from local greenhouses and nurseries, or there's a lot of online sources. And generally a seed packet comes with like hundreds of seeds in them. So you really only need a few, as you'll find. One or two vegetable plants goes a long way, unless you want to end up preserving your vegetables. So just some things to think about. So planting seeds inside, the ones that are not cold hardy, that will die if the night temperatures get below 32, those include peppers, tomatoes, eggplants, cucumbers, squashes, zucchini. Then the other ones you just want to get like a head start on. So again, it's just so that way you're not putting baby plants out there and waiting months for them to get big. You're getting a head start on the season. So when you're growing things inside, you want to give them bright light. So whether that's a south-facing window or grow lights, you can get really nerdy with grow lights, and there's a lot of different kinds, and they all, are different brightness and spectrums. And so you just want to do some research if that's the route that you take. Otherwise, a bright window is totally fine. You do want to make sure that these guys do not dry out or get cold, because they are baby plants and they need to be babied, because they're just not as tough if you let them dry out or freeze. Some people do get a warming mat because you really just want to mimic spring temperatures, get those seeds growing. And before you can put anything out in the garden, you need to prep it, whether you're using raised beds or planting right in the ground. You do want to have like a proportion of 3/4 topsoil, 1/4 compost. You can even go a little bit less with the compost, but you don't want to overdo it, because that's a bit too much for the plants. So if you're using raised beds, I would recommend that you fill it all the way up to the top with the soil. And that's to really promote, maximum root growth, especially if you're growing root vegetables like carrots and beets. I see some people fill up their raised beds and it's only halfway, and that's just not really ideal for healthy root growth. And a lot of the times then they're shaded by the walls of the containers. So just some things to think about. Make sure it's up to the top. If you're planting in the ground, depending on the situation that you're starting with, you might have to remove some grass. So in this case, I had actually started with a greenhouse, which blew away. So that was unfortunate. But I had the black mat already there that killed the grass. So you can use a black mat, you can use cardboard. And the theory behind that is it just suffocates and chokes out the existing vegetation, in a lot of cases lawn or just weeds. And then you can just remove what's left once it's already died back. And then you can amend your soil with compost. Do you guys have any questions so far? Okay, awesome.
I have a question actually.
Sure.
When you started your garden, did you like do a soil test or anything to see, your in-ground garden?
Yeah, that's a
Did you
great
do a soil
question.
test or anything?
Oh, I didn't. Just because I live in farmland, and actually I should mention that this pile here came from the neighboring dairy farm, so I knew it was like
Oh,
high in nutrients. So please don't compare your garden to mine. I had lots of nutrients, lots of nitrogen. But that is a great idea, especially for some people who, live in Wilton in the Saratoga area. It's very sandy, which tends to be more acidic, which is great for some plants like blueberries, tomatoes, and peppers, but generally plants prefer to be more neutral. So the Cornell Cooperative Extension in Boston Spa, you can send a soil sample there. You can even just buy little soil testing kits. When you test your soil, you just want to make sure that your soil is dry, so you're actually in the pH of the soil and not the water that's in the ground. Yeah, any other questions?
okay.
Is that good? Great. So as soon as the ground can be worked, there's a lot of plants that you can get started on right away. And when I say as soon as the ground can be worked, I mean, I'm out there in mid-March checking how far the ground is frozen. And as soon as there's like a few workable inches, I'm planting my seeds, but that's because I'm anxious and I'm just so ready to get outside. But a good portion of the garden can be planted as early as mid-March. So peas, spinach, kale, chard, carrots, beets, lettuce, bok choy, radish. Those all don't mind a frost. A freeze might hurt them. So a frost is 32 or lower. A freeze is in that 25 to 28 range. So yeah, so that's a great way to just get started while you're still getting your seedlings inside going and waiting for May to warm up. So here are some cold crops that I'm already enjoying even before I have anything in the garden, for the summer seedlings. So once it finally warms up at the end of May, normally Memorial Day, but if you just watch the weather and look at the nighttime lows, then you'll know when it's safe. So sometimes you can get a head start. Some people also use cold frames or hoop houses, and that's just a way to protect plants from the cold weather. Or if you really jump the gun, or if you're using containers, actually, you can put things outside during the day and bring them in at night. So that's another way to kind of get a head start on the season. But before you plant anything outside, you do want to harden off your seedlings. That means just putting them outside for a few hours each day in a sunny spot for normally about a week before you actually put them out in the garden. Because if you were to just put your seedlings in the garden right away, that would shock them if they're not used to being outside in bright sun. And that's not a really good start to your garden. Seedlings should also be a few inches tall and have true leaves. So as you can see here, these are, a good 6 inches tall. And they already have established leaves, not the new leaves that come out from the seeds. And then what was that?
I noticed that you don't have any fencing at all, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah, I'll get to that later, but this is my my pest patrol there. So she's one of them. But yeah, again, I'm really fortunate to live in an area where the deer do not come up to my house, and I have animals, pets that help just by their sense. But certainly fencing or even tall raised beds are definitely required in certain areas where you're growing. But yeah, when you're planting, right now everything looks very sparse and small, but you kind of have to think long term. How big is everything going to get? And again, when in doubt, read those seed packets or a tag if it came on a seedling you bought, and that'll tell you the true spacing. And I tend to overcrowd my gardens for a couple reasons, because I usually have a lot of seedlings to plant. But also a crowded garden means less space for sunlight to get in through to weeds. And then I'm just making the most of my space. So I just want to go back. As you can see back here, that's where I had a lot of my cold crops. So there's kale and chard and bok choy, and a lot of weeds. So when you're weeding, you want to make sure that you're getting all the roots out, because if you're just going to yank it or cut it, it's just going to grow back. And you want to make sure that as you're getting the roots out, you're not damaging the roots of your plants. So you can use a trowel, you can just use your hands and kind of grab the base and twist and pull up, and that's a good way to get all the roots. But if you leave the weeds in the garden, that it just adds competition for all the nutrients and the water that's in the soil, and it crowds out your plants. So you'll end up with stunted
I don't even
growth.
recognize you.
What was that? So after you've gotten a weeded garden, putting down some mulch can help keep those weeds out. It also helps to keep moisture in the ground, so you don't have to water as often. It doesn't evaporate as quickly. And over time, it does decompose. And so it does eventually add organic material to your garden as well. So when you're picking out your mulch, natural is best, especially if it's food that you're going to be eating. So straw, not hay, because hay has seeds in it. So you don't want to plant seed or hay in your garden. And then again, the natural mulch, undyed. I just got a couple bags of undyed shredded cedar and put that as a path down the center. And that was quite nice. I didn't have to weed it all in there. And you want to do at least, around 2 to 3 inches thick. If you don't do enough, then it's not doing its job. Weeds can still get through. It's not keeping moisture in the ground. And if you go too thick, you're keeping too much moisture in the ground, and then you end up with fungus problems. And that's true for any kind of gardens, like your perennial and your flower gardens. There's a sweet spot with mulch, and you don't want to go over that. So as the plants grow, they're going to get bigger. They're going to start crowding each other out. And just like weeds compete for nutrients, so do the vegetable plants. So you want to thin out your vegetables. Every few days I was out there just kind of picking a little bit, enough to cook with my dinner, then I'd go and thin them again. Especially the root vegetables like beets and carrots. You want to make sure they have enough space for their roots to actually get bigger. Don't feel bad. I know some people are like, these are baby plants. If you really feel that way, you can potentially transplant those seedlings if you have the space, but oftentimes it's not necessary. Just yank out the smaller ones and leave the larger ones with enough space for them to grow bigger. And then for watering, you want to make sure that your garden stays wet. If your plants dry out too much, too often, that stresses them out and affects the yield that you'll get. So early morning is best before the heat of the day. Otherwise, in the evening is better. Although if you water at night, there is the risk that as the nighttime temperatures drop down, cool, moist environments are ideal for fungus growth. So there's a risk, but more often than not, I was watering when I got home from work rather than on my way to work, and my garden was just fine. But if it is a really hot sunny day and you didn't water your plants and they're not looking hot, you don't want to water directly on the plants because that will actually burn the leaves. The water droplets kind of make these little magnifying glasses on the leaves, and that will burn them. So you're going to want to water the base of the plants so that the water still get into their roots, but not on the leaves. And some people set up a drip line system, so it just continuously permeates water, and you can set up timers. If watering is not your thing, there's ways to just make it happen automatically. So as the season goes on and the weather gets hotter and things get bigger, you can be harvesting your cold crops. some plants like lettuce and spinach, and the greens, the green families, as they get hot, they're gonna bolt. And bolting is basically they make their seeds. They get tall, they make flowers, and then they create their seeds, which does affect the taste of the greens. So they'll get bitter, so that lettuce and the spinach will not taste as good once it goes to flower. You can continually like cut it back to try to keep that at bay. But what people often do is they stagger their plantings. So as plants bolt or as you harvest them, like your beets and your carrots, once you harvest it, that plant's gone, you can be planting more seeds. So you can kind of set up like a schedule, like every week or every other week, you can plant some more seeds so that as you're harvesting, you're also getting some new crops, because these guys, they just all won't last the heat of the summer. So yeah, if you do all that, your garden will slowly get very big. So, in the beginning, when I was mentioning how squashes and such get big, you can see they started off like that, and eventually they came all the way through to the front yard. The sunflowers, I put them in as just seeds, in the beginning of May, imagining how tall they would get. And they ended up twice my size, and I could see them out my second story window. Again, I had cow crap in my garden, so everything grows huge. But I also did kind of plan some of this where I kept the shorter things in the front, the taller things in the back. I knew here there was some bok choy and some other early spring crops that by the time they were done, the squash had space to kind of fill out. And some of that comes with experience and trial and error, but there are just, those things to think about when you think about like the life cycle of your garden and what you're going to be eating when. Because as you can see here, early spring, my peas are growing up, and by the end, they're gone. And yeah, the reason why we garden is to get the food. So this was a very prolific garden, and I was constantly giving away vegetables and cooking meals and freezing them, which was awesome to enjoy in the middle of winter. But this was about, every week, on the weekends, I was hauling that much or so. And just so you can see, like obviously the squashes were very prolific. Those just kept going. The peppers were as well. You don't see the green beans there because I tend to eat those at the garden while I'm weeding. But this is just an idea of the bounty that comes with growing. And growing vegetables is great, but growing flowers is also pretty awesome. It's really beautiful to see my front yard full of color. It brings me a lot of joy. I really enjoyed being able to share bouquets with people, if I was going to meet somebody, and especially last year was so awful. So just being able to give people flowers or just vegetables, it was a very little thing that does make a difference, and not just for humans, but for pollinators as well. These are all pictures taken in my garden. So over here are zinnias, got marigolds. It didn't have cosmos. There's the nasturtiums. This is a squash plant. And the sunflowers there. This is actually a swallowtail butterfly caterpillar that was enjoying the celery. But as you can tell, this was a buffet for a lot of beneficial critters around, and it was really neat to get to see them in action and visiting all the plants, and just knowing that made a difference. It wasn't just another lawn that didn't provide anything for the little critters that help us out. And, if it wasn't for pollinators, none of these vegetables would have grown anyways. So I would definitely encourage you to add flowers to your gardens as well. There are some benefits as well to like planting marigolds. The scent can actually ward off some pests that aren't desirable in your garden. The theory behind planting nasturtiums is that other beetles and bugs will eat the nasturtiums rather than your vegetables that you want them to avoid. And a lot of those I actually just planted from seed at the end of May. So I didn't even have to go and buy like a flat of flowers. It's super affordable, and it was really neat to see them finally bloom. So, and the flowers are actually the ones that lasted the longest. These were actually taken at the end of October. So a lot of the vegetables had already been cleared out, like the beans. I think the peppers were still going. But as you can see, a lot of those early spring stuff are gone. The nasturtiums just filled out, which again was great for all the pollinators, you know, when everything else, like a lot of the traditional gardens you see, not much is blooming at the end of October besides mums and sedum and asters. So it was great to be able to provide a little bit more for the pollinators. So knowing when to clean up your garden. Most plants will die after a frost, like all the plants that you have to wait until the end of May to plant, they will die if once the temperatures get below 32 at night, normally mid-October. But there are some plants that actually taste better after a frost. They get sweeter because they're storing all that energy that they've made as sugar within them. So plants like kale, carrots, beets, and Brussels sprouts, those are great to actually leave in your garden as long as possible before a hard freeze. So that's 20 or below, and that'll just get rid of all of them. So when the fall comes, I'm just looking at the weather, seeing when I need to harvest my garden, and taking advantage of as long as I can. So I show these pictures here because ironically, even though it snowed, it did not get below 32 degrees. So the snow did not kill my vegetables or my flowers, and I still picked a lovely bouquet after that. But here you can see after a freeze, it gets all droopy and that the cosmos there are dead. So I cut back the garden, put it in wheelbarrows, and I'm lucky that I live next to a farm. So I brought a lot of that to the pig farm next door, and they got to enjoy all the vegetable scraps. I know not everybody lives next to a farm, but chances are there are some local farms in the area with goats, pigs, horses, cows, that, you know, if you call ahead, that they might potentially want, like your old pumpkins or your old vegetable plants. And it's better than just putting it in the trash or the city. I mean, if you live within Saratoga and they pick up, I totally understand that. But you can also compost, because there's a lot of nutrients in that plant matter. And if you compost it, then you can add those back to the soil, which then gets added back to your vegetables and ultimately the food that you're eating. Late in the season, when the sunflowers had dried up, there was just birds all over the garden, all these chickadees and blue jays fighting over the sunflower seeds. So when I cleaned up the garden, I just cut off the heads and tossed them there for anybody to enjoy, and they did. And again, it's just really nice to know late in the season there are critters getting some food before it gets cold. And then here's my pest control crew. This is Cleo and Mips. They, you know, just by them being in the vicinity of the garden and their scents, that can help ward off animals. And I know not everybody has pests, so a sturdy fence is certainly good. Some, you know, if you have a raised bed, you might want to put like a wire mesh when you're first installing that, so critters like groundhogs and chipmunks can't burrow underneath. So, you know, if you're building raised beds, sometimes you want to make them taller than like the standard foot. I see a lot, at least a couple feet, so bunnies and such can't get in there. And a lot of the times nature just works out on its own. So this is a tomato hornworm. If you've had tomatoes, you've probably seen those. If you miss those and they hang out there for half a day or so, there goes your plant. They will strip them clean, and they're the same color as the stem, so they're a little bit hard to see. But if you see one covered with little white specks, then that means a parasitic wasp is doing the job for you, and you don't need to worry, it's already been killed. So that's pretty cool. And I do want to point out that throughout this whole season, I did not use any chemicals at all. which meant that maybe some of my greens might have had some holes, some bugs in them, but it doesn't really overall damage the quality of the food that I was eating. And not having chemicals certainly was a lot healthier. And there are some organic pesticides as well, I think like Safer or 8. So if you do have a pest problem that you do need to deal with, there are organic alternatives. And since this is titled Grow Foods, Not Lawns, I do want to mention that that's what my lawn looked like a lot of the times. Again, I live in the middle of the nowhere and I don't have judgmental neighbors, luckily. But having a shaggy lawn didn't really decrease my quality of life that much. And it actually saved me a lot of money. Every now and then I would hire the neighbor kid next door to mow it, but I wasn't really concerned if it wasn't a monogamous, you know what I mean? Just one type of plant throughout. And actually my animals really enjoyed chewing on the grass as well. And again, seeing the bees on the dandelions, to me, that's more worth it than a perfect lawn. And so yeah, so if you guys have gardened, it makes you happy. It's good for you. If you've seen my work around town, hopefully it's brightened up your day a bit. There's just so many benefits to gardening. The food is the most nutritious as soon as it's picked. So growing it in your yard is a lot more nutritious than getting food shipped from Mexico. You know exactly where it came from, what was put on it, and nothing beats that peace of mind, especially if nutrition is important to you. And I haven't been to a gym in a while. I just garden a lot. And I know that's my job, so not everyone is gonna be like that, but there's just a lot of benefits to gardening. And that's that. Any questions?
Rachelle, can you show us what you're growing behind you? We see seedlings.
yes.
There. What's back there?
Hold on. I'm sorry. So I'm such a gardener. I'm not a tech person. I'm trying to figure out how to get to see you guys all again. Got it. Okay. So pull up my laptop.
Oh,
Yeah, so I have the grow lights off right now at a couple different times, but they're just a little bit bright. Sorry, this is awkward. I'm just holding my. So this is my basement, and so what I have here, these are all like my squashes. So I have pumpkins. These are all acorn squashes. I just have a couple cucumbers popping up right now. I have a lot of zinnia flowers. I have tomatoes and broccoli. This is cilantro. And then over here, my daughter wanted her own seedlings away from mine. So she's growing her own garden. But yeah, these guys are already getting big. They're starting to grow some of their true leaves. So you can see they all start off with dicotyledons. They're 2 leaves. And then you can kind of see it with these tomatoes. They're starting to make their true leaves. So when those get bigger and these all get taller, then they're good to go outside.
now how long ago did you plant those?
Just a couple weeks.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, maybe like 2-3 weeks. But
Good.
yeah, it's not too late to start seeds too. If you wanted, to get a head start, like any head start is better than starting at May. And you can always buy seedlings too. There's a lot of local greenhouses that sell organic seedlings. And even I cheat and do that too, because sometimes they don't work out, or sometimes they're just not tall enough. So it doesn't hurt to buy seedlings.
Rochelle,
I do have,
oh, I can't, am I muted or unmuted?
No, you're good.
I wondered, I grew delicata squash last year, but I did not get anywhere near. How many delicata squash plants did you put in? Do you
I
remember?
think I just did 2.
Oh my gosh.
They were crazy. In fact, in some of the pictures, the delicata squashes grew up the sunflowers and used them as a trellis. So then I had squashes hanging off the sunflowers, and I did not plan that.
So is that because of the cow manure that you used, you think?
I think so. And it's full sun.
Yeah.
But normally squashes do tend to be quite prolific. Like they'll just keep going. And especially like anyone who's grown zucchini, you look away or like you turn over a big leaf and suddenly there's this big giant you missed. Anyone who's known zucchini totally can relate. And I have a really great chocolate zucchini recipe or chocolate zucchini cake recipe for anybody who wants. But
We want it. We want it.
okay.
Rachelle.
Yeah.
Hi, this is my second year growing my garden, and I'm just curious. I did a raised bed. Is there anything I should do to prep the raised bed? Like, do I need brand new soil in there? Just throw a bag of compost in, or just turn it over and it should be good to go?
Good question. So you don't need to replace your soil, but I would recommend adding compost to the garden every year because, you know, as plants grow and as the rain rains, like nutrients are leached from the soil. So it's always a good idea to add some compost to that. And I say compost and not like fertilizer is okay too, but compost is more like longer lasting. For your garden. It's not as water soluble, so those nutrients are going to stay in your soil longer. But in regards to you saying turning the soil, there's actually like a lot more research coming out now that it's best to leave your soil unagitated as much as possible because that's a biome in itself. There's mycorrhizae growing, that's beneficial fungus that helps your plants absorb nutrients it wouldn't otherwise get from the soil. And there's beneficial bacteria and earthworms and all those sort of things. And so if you're turning your soil a lot, then you're kind of breaking that up. So that's why like weeding, I keep that like isolated to where the weeds are. I'm not hoeing up the whole space. And that's kind of the philosophy behind like the no-till as well, like putting that plastic sheet or cardboard to kill what's there. You're not unnecessarily destroying your soil.
Thank you.
Sure. Oh, and I do see people were wondering about compost. I go to Agway for a lot of like my bulk product needs. If you have a truck, it's fairly affordable to go there and get a yard dump. They do deliver within like the Saratoga, Boston Spa area. Boost Blend is great. I think Wild Apple also has it. DPW also sells it. That's super cheap, but it's hit or miss because that is reliant on the material that people put out there to get picked up. And so there's debris, sometimes there's weed seeds in there. So it's cheap and it works, but there might be some better alternatives. Oh, I see companion planting. Yes. So when I first started gardening, it was, after I had taken botany at SUNY Adirondack and I had my botany book, and in the back was a whole diagram of companion planting. And that's how I planned my garden. I was like, okay, you guys are friends. You guys go next to each other. I since have gone more with just grouping, like having sections for each plant. When I first started, I was really mingling them. So I'm not an expert on companion gardening, but there's a lot of cool diagrams, like Venn diagrams, where you can see the overlap of what goes well. So I think like basil and tomatoes, they go well together. And a lot of the times it's because they just need similar conditions too. Like those both prefer more acidic soil. But there are beneficial ways. And there's also ways, not necessarily a companion, but like pair plant, like based off how they grow. So like I will put my cucumbers next to my peas so that by the time the peas are gone, my cucumbers are getting big up the trellis. And so that's a way to kind of stagger the garden as well. Crop rotation, square foot planting. What do you mean by square foot planting? I think I know what you mean, but can you explain? Who asked that question? Is that C? Is that how you say your name?
Yeah.
What do you mean by square foot planting? Do you mean just like the space or keeping things in groups, or what do you mean? Okay, well, I'm sorry. I guess I can't answer that question. I'm sorry. But crop rotations, that is a good idea because every plant uses its own like proportion of nutrients and also can put back, like legumes, they are nitrogen fixers, so they will put more nitrogen back into the soil. Whereas I imagine plants like squash, like, so nitrogen is good for like leafy growth. So if you have too much nitrogen in your soil, you might end up with too much like vegetable growth and not enough fruit growth. So it is a good idea to rotate your crops. I mean, you still want to consider the sunlight and keeping tall things in the back or, you know, short things in the front so the sunlight can still get to what needs it. And especially when you run into issues like blight or like mildew, things that actually live in the soil. So if you have blight for your, I mean, honestly, tomato blight is quite common, and more often than not, it doesn't really affect your yield, but you can just trim up bottom leaves if they're touching the soil, and that can help avoid it. But in theory, if you have an issue with your soil, then you want to avoid planting that same vegetable in that same spot for at least a year or two to kind of let it settle. Because then you're not giving that, you know, that fungus its food that it needs. So those are some things to consider. So just reading this. So being in sandy soil, we have lots of ants with 2-foot raised beds and would see swarms of them coming up in spots. Got it. Yeah, so it's always a battle dealing with any kind of pest, and there's a lot of creative ways to deal with it. None of them are really foolproof, you know, without using chemicals, which I don't really like to use. I don't know specifically about ants. I'm trying to think. But I mean, I don't know if there's a way to like, because I know like, you know, with like herbicide, you can do like vinegar, dish soap, and salt. And so I wonder if something like that would also kill ants. But I'm sorry, I don't really know specifically about how to deal with ants. Yeah, that's what I was about to say, Diana. Thank you. That like ants don't really harm your plants, and I do want to mention that too. That like in the garden there are a lot of bugs, and most of them are probably just fine, besides like the tomato hornworm and aphids. But again, there are ways to deal with that. You can get ladybugs. Some people get praying mantises. Yes, buy a magnifying glass, or just be like me and take pictures of all of them and show them to your kids. Yeah, do you guys have any other questions or anything that you guys have tried or that has worked?
Yeah. How many hours of sunlight, direct sunlight, does your garden get each day? Do you have any idea? Because I feel like I'm a little more shaded and I don't get sun all day long. So I
Yeah,
think that
it
kind of
is
puts me at a
important.
disadvantage, but I have to deal with the trees that are around me.
You do, and in that case, you might be better off growing more things like greens rather than things that require like that flowering and fruiting
High
cycle.
sun. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so maybe more like kale or lettuce or things like that. I mean, ultimately, they all want as much sun as possible. I think my garden starts getting full sun, you know, as early as like 9 or 10 in the morning, and then it's just, you know, you can see back here, like that's the sunset. So it's just getting all that. And if you
Okay.
do have to choose, it's like afternoon sun is the best. If it's like partial
Okay, yeah,
sunlight and you have a choice, like if you can pick when.
Yeah, I don't really have a choice. So yeah, I get mostly in the morning until about 2 or 3 o'clock, then the shade starts taking over.
Okay.
So,
I do think maybe
but yeah, that's good.
celery might be better with the shade, because I grew celery for the first time and it looked like it was suffering in the front of the garden. And I have seen that grown under trees. So you can experiment. A lot of gardening is really just trial and error and seeing what works for your space and your soil. And all right, growing
Yeah.
tomatoes. That's a very common one. So growing tomatoes, they get very tall and lanky, so they do need to be staked. So thinning out tomatoes is very important, because if the tomato had it its way, it would just keep going. And so what you'll find with tomatoes is that they make these little suckers. So like, here's the main stalk, and here's a shoot that comes off, and then there's another one that comes up in the nook. And if you let that go, it's just going to make another branch with more leaves, and it just keeps putting all its energy into making more branches and more leaves. And so you want to just periodically go and get the little suckers out of the nooks. You can even just like heavily cut off entire stems and stalks, like, you know, before it flowers, or you can just be selective, leaving the ones that have the flowers, and because flowers mean fruit. In this case, a vegetable, but that debate is still up in the air with tomatoes. But you don't need to worry about hurting the plant. You can trim heavy and it will still produce. They are a good one to fertilize if you wanted to, like, regularly add, you know, some water soluble fertilizer. And again, with like the blight too, it is, you can trim those bottom leaves up just to start with, and that can kind of hold off any blight that it might get. Blight is when the leaves get like yellowish brownish spots all over, and those just die off, and you can pick those off and it will still produce fruit. It doesn't affect your actual tomato. And the cool thing about tomatoes too is that when you plant them outside, you can plant them deep and they will actually grow new roots when you plant them deep. A lot of plants, and this is true for perennials and bushes and trees especially, if you plant them too deep, they will die because they are having moisture against the root, the crown of the plant. And so that, you know, unnecessary moisture encourages rot and, you know, and fungus. And so you want to avoid that when you're planting just about anything else. But tomatoes, you can plant deep and they'll just make new roots. And so if that's a nice thing to know, if you did start your plants early inside and they got really lanky, you can, you know, get a little bit more support by planting them deeper. Also, a tip I learned when I did the Master Gardener course with the Cornell, if you do start your seedlings too early and they start to get lanky, you can brush the top of them, and that kind of encourages more like axillary growth rather than like tall growth, or you can just trim them too. So that's just a tip if you're like panicking and you're like, oh my God, I started my seedlings in January and now they're like sun-starved and all wobbly. Like, you can do damage control. Yeah.
All right, any last questions for Rachelle?
I got one more. I know that you had said it's not good to till your entire garden soil. So it sounds like you just want to plant, if you're planting a seedling, you just want to disturb the soil enough to plant the seedling in. And so when adding compost at the beginning of the season, do you want to mix that in or just put it on top, or what's the best way to kind of do that without kind of really turning the whole soil over?
No, that's a great point. We were just establishing our garden, so in that case, we just did the whole thing. But you can just do isolated compost as you plant, and we do this a lot. Like new perennial gardens that we plant, we just make the hole, you know, a bit bigger than the actual plant needs, and then we work in compost at the base. I mean, in theory though, you just want like a few inches of compost, because the roots are going to go where the nutrients are. And so if you only have compost like on the top, then they're only going to really stay on the top. And so
that's where the roots are going to want to be.
Yeah. And so at some point, yes, you do need to mix things in, because you don't want to end up with like layers where like, oh, lots of nutrients here, then bam, there's sand, or you know, it's just, it's not going to be ideal for root growth.
Yeah.
And that's true for watering in general, when you water, you want to really soak the plants. So my rule of thumb, whenever I water anything, is I water until the water puddles, and then I let that soak in, and then I water again until it puddles. And so that kind of ensures that it's being absorbed and then actually flushing through, because again, if you just water a little bit and it looks wet on top, it's not actually getting through. And if it's a container, you can see the water running through, but you just really want to, whenever you water anything, give it a good soak.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Cool.
All
Well,
right.
I'm glad I can inspire you and hopefully teach you guys a few new things. It's easier than you think. And a lot of it is just kind of playing or just trial and error. Everybody's gardens are different, conditions are different, and even the weather every year changes. So don't be concerned if one year something did great and the next year it didn't. Don't stress it. So.
All right.
Great, thank you.
So much.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
thank you so much.
My pleasure. Happy gardening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Ciao.